Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Hey, it's Thursday on the Three Martini Lunch, and we are really glad that you have joined us for another day of all crazy martinis, actually, today. But three more martinis. There's good elements, bad elements, and crazy elements to all of them, but all of them have enough crazy that we're going crazy across the board. And hey, why not? So let's start with the Democratic presidential primary. Of course, Saturday is the South Carolina primary, and then Tuesday is Super Tuesday. 14 different states will be voting, lots of delegates being awarded, particularly California and Texas being the biggest prizes. But even before the votes are held in South Carolina and on Super Tuesday, Jim, it's always fun to watch campaigns give you the rationale for why no matter what happens, they're going on. And with some of them, it makes sense. Obviously, Bernie's, no matter what happens, going to go on. But the others are also saying that this is going to happen. Joe Biden, according to the latest couple of polls in South Carolina, has opened up a pretty sizable lead. If that's the case, even though that's where he was a month ago, it's going to be seen as a massive resurgence, and he's going to have super momentum going into Super Tuesday. And any delegate pickups there is going to be more than enough reason to keep going. Then you got Mike Bloomberg. He's, of course, thrown about $500 million into this already. His campaign is saying a lot of things are going to be decided by Super Tuesday, but you have to think that unless they get completely obliterated, that they are having every intention of continuing on to all the other states. They are the ones making the argument the hardest that just because Joe Biden wins by a lot in South Carolina is not a big deal because it was always expected. It was only recently due to Biden's own poor showing in earlier states that the question even arose as to whether he could still win in South Carolina. Then you've got the more complicated approach. That's Pete Buttigieg, whose campaign says in a memo that its objective on Super Tuesday is to minimize the margins of victory by Bernie Sanders and maximize delegate accumulation by congressional district, not states, because that's how a lot of them are allocated. So if they can get to certain thresholds in different counties and different jurisdictions in different states, they can still pile up a few delegates here and there and give them a rationale to continue. That's not to say that Warren and Klobuchar and Steyer won't come up with a rationale either. I just haven't seen their campaigns come up with them so far, Jim. So it's always fun for candidates to say the voters are going to decide this, and they just don't listen to them anyway.
You know, Greg, I was thinking about this and discussing this with somebody last night, and we had this observation that maybe in politics we don't have any elder statesmen at all, but the people who traditionally would play that role in the Democratic Party right now aren't interested in playing that role. You could point to President Obama and maybe Michelle Obama. You could point to the Clintons. You could point to Nancy Pelosi is clearly in a position of leadership of the party. You can even go back to somebody like Al Gore, right? Or just somebody who is respected by everybody, who's been around a long time, who's been playing the political game for a long time. And if there was people who were in this role, first of all, much earlier in this process, they would have gone to someone like Michael Bennet, Deval Patrick, people who are in that 1% range and saying, look, it's not happening for you. You're still a relatively young man. You still have a future. If we win this cycle, there are cabinet positions that will be up for grabs. There will be other roles in future administrations or other roles in politics. Maybe you want to run for governor someday. The decisions you make right now will have consequences for that. You're not doing anything in this race. Please get out. And they could have done that then and, narrowed the field before, you had these silly folks staying in long past their prime. And you could still say people making this sort of a message to an Amy Klobuchar right now, or maybe even a Pete Buttigieg right now, and or some sort of message, maybe even to Joe Biden to say, Joe, we love you. It's clearly not happening for you this cycle. At this point, you're just dividing the folks who need to be, united behind a centrist option or a non-openly socialist option. It's time for, there are people who traditionally would play this kind of role, and they've chosen not to. And so as a result, there is no force coming in and saying, look, you really got to get out. In light of that, they then are like, well, okay, how can we imagine a scenario in which it makes sense to stay in? Now, Biden is probably going to win South Carolina. There's some polling that indicates he's going to have a good one. And, hey, good for you, Mr. Vice President. The next question is, what are you doing on Super Tuesday? And then lucky for him, there's a bunch of southern states. And if you think that, African Americans and older voters and slightly more conservative Democrats are the base for a Joe Biden campaign. Maybe he can have a good day on Super Tuesday, win a couple of states, and get back in this. If he doesn't, it's kind of fair to ask, okay, Joe, this is not happening for you. You were fifth in New Hampshire, right? This is, it's time to recognize reality and help us unite behind somebody else. For Bloomberg, if you can't get there after spending $400 million, it's not going to happen for you, right? I'm sure Bloomberg could always say, "Oh yeah, wait till I spend $800 million." But really, at some point, if you can't gain traction after dominating the airwaves for weeks and weeks, and as we've discussed on previous podcasts, in states like Virginia, having the airwaves to yourself, if you're not winning states in that scenario, if you're not close to second place in that scenario, it's just not going to happen for you. Pete Buttigieg, another situation where, Pete, you ran a great campaign in Iowa and a pretty darn good campaign in New Hampshire. The problem is you can't replicate that everywhere. And you can't run in 15 states at once. And there's a really good chance you're just going to get shellacked on Super Tuesday. And once that happens, it doesn't make sense for you to stay in this race. Everybody pursuing their own naked self-interest in this situation is setting up a situation where Bernie Sanders gets the biggest plurality. I keep saying biggest plurality. Everyone reminds me. A plurality is the biggest percentage.
Right.
So yeah, no one's winning the smallest plurality. That if you do that, you don't have a plurality. But Bernie Sanders is going to go into the convention with 40% of the vote or so, and probably a bigger chunk of the delegates. They don't have winner take all states, but everything is above that 15% threshold. Anybody who has a Klobuchar or Buttigieg, respectable 9 to 15%, 9 to 14%, that's great, but it doesn't get any delegates. It doesn't count. The idea that, we're going to make this up in congressional districts. No, you're not, right? At this point, you're competing for an impressive third place, and you don't win the race when you're an impressive third place. So it's really kind of fascinating to see this. This is a party that really could use this. It's obvious to everybody except the people who are most involved with this, Greg.
Jim, it's like you said in a couple of other political situations, is that these people sticking in the race, even when the numbers and the results of the early primaries don't go their way, they're staying in because they're grounded in a very firm principle. And the principle is that they should be president of the United States.
Yes.
And all the lofty rhetoric about how this isn't about me, this is about you and your hopes and your dreams. It's just a bunch of malarkey, as Joe Biden would say. And it's really all about ego, because ultimately at some point you have to think that out of 320-some million people, you're the best person for the job. And then to come to the realization that the people don't actually want you is a little bit of a shot to that ego, and it's hard to actually admit it.
Greg, I'm going to quote a very funny line from Shaquille O'Neal at the memorial ceremony for Kobe and his daughter, where he said apparently they had some exchange that Kobe wasn't passing enough. And Shaquille O'Neal went over to him and said, Kobe, there's no I in team. I'm going to clean up the language a little bit, but basically Kobe Bryant answered, no, but there's an M-E in that word.
Yes, exactly. There is an M and an E for me, and that's what we're going to see here. So we'll see if they're just spinning so people don't give up on them before Super Tuesday. But if all these people stay in after Super Tuesday, that will just be amazing. And hey, Tom Steyer's probably going to finish second or third in South Carolina, which is his best finish. So by his metrics, why not?
Well, it's because of all the Scottish people there. All the Clan MacLeods voting for McStyer.
All right, well, let's talk about our second crazy martini now, Jim. And we've talked about coronavirus a number of times, just talked about it a couple of days ago, in fact, as the markets were tanking. And in fact, they're still not exactly in a good mood as different nations reporting different levels of coronavirus cases and in some cases fatalities. Obviously, China is the epicenter, but now South Korea and Italy and other nations have reported at least one case. And even the head of the CDC here has said you got to be ready for some sort of disruptions here, possibly closing schools for a time, or maybe workplaces need to work on telework options and that sort of thing. Well, President Trump tried to downplay the issue on, or at least calm people down on the issue on his trip to India earlier this week. Then yesterday, when he got back to the U.S., he held a briefing at the White House, put Mike Pence as the head of the response to the coronavirus challenge. Obviously, HHS and CDC and all these other alphabet soups are going to be involved as well. But now that the markets are freaking out and people are paying more attention, we've officially come to the conclusion in the liberal media that this is really Trump's fault. And so just a few different insights here. You've got Brian Stelter over at CNN tweeting yesterday, since the dawn of the Trump era, countless experts have warned that the president's lack of credibility would imperil the country in the event of an emergency. As the coronavirus outbreak worsens, those fears may be coming true. Over at the New York Times, you've got opinion columnist Gail Collins with the title, "Let's Call It Trump Virus." Subhead, if you're feeling awful, you know who to blame. Over at MSNBC, Chris Hayes tweets out, when Mike Pence was governor of Indiana, his public health record was so stellar that his state policy led directly to a large HIV outbreak. We don't know exactly how large that is. I'm sure statistics exist. Basically, Mike Pence
was a needle sharing program.
Yeah, Mike Pence was not a fan of.
Mike Pence did not like the idea of taxpayers handing out needles to drug addicts.
Big surprise.
Which doesn't strike me as a crazy point of view. I can understand health policy experts saying, look, the absolute most important thing is to not, let the disease spread further. So the right thing to do is to hand out needles to people who are addicted to drugs. And I don't think Mr. John Q. Public is a crazy person for looking at that and saying, I don't know if I want to do that. But anyway, I didn't mean to continue, Greg.
No, that's exactly the clarification we needed to make there. And secondly, I'm pretty sure that coronavirus is not transmitted that way, so I'm not sure how it's relevant to this particular case. But Mike Pence does have executive experience, so I would say he's pretty competent to handle this. But the point is now that instead of talking about, we're all going to die, which I guess they're still all doing to some level, even though the experts say it's most likely going to be about 2% and people with compromised respiratory systems, as you have pointed out day after day. But this has now turned starkly political now that Trump has actually spoken out on it and put his team in place.
Yeah, one of the things, you and I have talked about coronavirus a couple times on this podcast, it was kind of weird that as we first seeing these reports in China and how serious it seemed, the dominant U.S. mainstream media, not just the big national cable news, Washington Post, New York Times, all that kind of stuff, but even think about your local news, Greg. How many times have you watched your local television news coverage? And it's always been like, this common home appliance may be trying to kill you. We'll tell you which one at 11. This tone of anything can turn into a really, frightening topic. Right? They like to hype that things are dangerous and scary. If your child talks to a stranger, they may be abducted tomorrow. This constant hype. But all of a sudden, coronavirus, it's like, it's really not. It's no worse than the flu. You're more likely to die from the common flu than you are from coronavirus. Stop freaking out, people. I mean, it was this very weird, subdued tone to it. And I think Ross Douthat had a good column where he pointed out that folks on the right didn't want to say that things looked really bad and ominous because Trump is president. We want to believe that, Trump's in control. The economy's roaring. Nothing to worry about here. And people on the left didn't want to say, hey, foreigners coming over here might have diseases and be a threat to you. And oh, by the way, globalization and the interconnected economy might be a bad idea. So everybody's got some incentive to downplay the concerns about this. Well, now it's reached a level where we really do have to worry about this. Today's Morning Jolt is all about the good news. And to summarize it very quickly, whatever else you think of Trump or the administration or something like that, the odds are very good that your local hospital, that your local first responders, local state health officials near you, they train pretty much since 9/11, if not before. They've been training for bioterror. They've been training for natural disasters and mass casualty terrorism attacks and stuff like that. They're prepared for the worst case scenario. Did they prepare for this precise worst case scenario? No, but they generally know if they get a whole bunch of infections of really sick people at one time, here's how we react. Here's how we try to isolate the people who are sick. Here's how we try to stop it from spreading. Do we know that this system is going to work perfectly? No. But one of the things that is worth keeping in mind here is the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Department of Health and Human Services, the whole Trump administration, even if they make every decision right, coronavirus could still be a pretty serious and disruptive problem. There is no button to press in the American government to say, stop this problem from getting any worse. It's not that easy, right? But so far, everybody in this process seems to know what they're supposed to do. There are some concerns about shortages of masks and certain equipment and stuff like that. Maybe we shouldn't have been having that stuff made in China all these years. That seems like a little bit of an ominous point. But and also, I go through the numbers. If you are healthy, if you're a non-smoker, if you're not elderly, you're probably going to be fine based on what we know now. I don't want to oversell it. I don't want to, tell you there's no danger here. Now, there is bad news. Japan just said we're canceling all schools for a month. In Hong Kong, it's going 2 months. Saudi Arabia just canceled access to Mecca, which is pretty darn important in the Muslim faith. There's, the International Olympic Committee said they're going to have to look at, whether they need to change anything regarding the Olympics in Japan later this summer. This is going to be a big deal, and nobody should downplay it. But the other reason I thought about why this wasn't getting the huge amount of saturation coverage that it's gotten in the past 24 to 48 hours. So one is the markets are freaking out, and that gives you another angle to the story. But the other thing is that it wasn't a political story. There was no, this is Trump's fault angle. And so in the last 24 hours, there's been this generation of, well, it is Trump's fault. Now, of course, the common argument for this has been that Trump wanted to cut the CDC by X percent. Well, he proposed that in his budget. And as so many people in America don't seem to understand this. Presidential budgets carry no weight. They're not law. This is basically the president saying, if I had budgetary control, this is how I'd spend the money. And Congress says, that's nice. We're going to allocate the money the way we want through appropriations bills and through the omnibus. And that's how it works. So there were no cuts to the CDC under Trump. The whole idea of, but Trump wanted to cut CDC is completely immaterial to dealing with the problem at hand. So listeners, if you're a non-smoker who takes care of your health and you're taking basic preventative steps like washing your hands, you're probably going to be fine. I'm a little more worried about the rest of the world, and I'm a little more worried about how the effect of this on the rest of the world. But how quickly this has turned into a political football, and how much people want to turn this into a political football, is really troubling and disturbing at a time like this, Greg.
Yeah, and you got some weird ideas out there. Apparently, Rod Rosenstein's sister is a top official, if not the top official at the CDC. So you've got folks wondering if she's...
It's the deep state.
The deep state there. And you got other folks thinking folks on the left are cheering for the markets to tank so the strong economy is not there for Trump to run on later this year. And who knows? There's probably some people cheering for that. But in the end, read your morning jolt. You'll know the facts, and we'll all get through this. All right, let's move back to South Carolina for our crazy now, because obviously the big event there this Saturday is the Democratic presidential primary. There is no Republican primary, much to the chagrin of William Weld and probably Joe Walsh, even though he's dropped out. But just because Trump is going to get all the delegates from South Carolina at the Republican National Convention doesn't mean that the Trump campaign in South Carolina is telling folks to sit this one out on Saturday when it's just the Democrats' time to vote. Here is an ad from the Trump campaign in South Carolina.
Hi, I'm Karen with the Spartanburg Tea Party.
And I'm Stacy, a grassroots activist.
South Carolina Republicans have waited since 2016 to vote again for President Trump.
With no Republican primary in South Carolina, voters will have to wait until November to cast a vote for our president.
But there's still a way South Carolina Republicans can support President Trump.
Even after losing in Iowa and New Hampshire, Joe Biden is still the favorite in South Carolina.
We all know that the DNC and the Democrat establishment do not want the independent senator from Vermont as their nominee.
We're asking South Carolina Republicans to show their support for President Trump by crossing over and voting in the Democratic primary for Senator Bernie Sanders. We feel this may help move the needle in closing our primaries in South Carolina.
Help us help President Trump by going to your polling location on Saturday, February 29th, and voting for independent Bernie Sanders to be the Democrat nominee.
All right. So, Jim, I think the one good point in there is that they think a byproduct of this effort will be to get the primaries to be closed in the future, meaning that independents can't vote. I think you and I would probably agree on that. And I guess even crossover is an option in South Carolina. But when you're out there specifically cheering for certain people in the other party to win, you might get what you want, and the result of that might not be what you want. So how careful do Trump supporters in South Carolina and just folks in general need to be when they consider tinkering with the other party's primary?
Yeah, so I think you can have one of two principled viewpoints. One is, and one you and I have advocated on this podcast for a while, is the Democratic nominee should be selected by Democrats. The Republican nominee should be selected by Republicans. If you want a say in a party's decision, you should join that party. If that strikes you as too much of too much of a burden, too much of a commitment, then you don't get a say. I think this is not a good idea. I don't like New Hampshire, the way that, independents might vote for, I pick party and stick to it. And if you want to leave. But, at the very least, you should have to go down and, file the paperwork to change your party registration and all that kind of stuff. For those listening, by the way, Virginia is doesn't register anyone by party. So theoretically, Greg and I could vote for anybody. I believe, if you think this is a bad idea, then you should do it. And oh, by the way, the fact that the other side does it, if you decide I'm going to do it, fine. If you decide, but that means that next time Democrats decide to vote in a Republican primary to nominate Todd Aiken or some nut, in a Republican primary, that's going to, they're doing the same mentality you are. Everybody's convinced that the other guy's wrongdoing justifies them doing the same thing. You end up in this cycle where it never ever stops. I think the argument of we should have, that we should end this era of anybody voting for anybody they want. Fine. Second thing is that if you're a conservative, nominating Bernie Sanders means I concur with the assessment. He is probably among the easiest to beat out of all the Democrats. But the consequences of being wrong about that, the consequences of Bernie Sanders winning in November are really, really bad. I was talking with somebody the other day. Biden, Klobuchar, I don't really like these folks, although I think if you had a Republican Congress and them, you could end up with something akin to like a late Bill Clinton type presidency, right? That Biden's a deal maker. Klobuchar is actually, Senate Republicans say she's actually fairly easy to work with. You could probably get something done if we had control of the legislative branch. Right now we don't. That could happen in November, but nobody knows how it's going to shake out. So, seems like a really big gamble. Bernie Sanders, if Bernie Sanders wins, Democrats got a giant heaping serving of karma in November 2016. I think Republicans for Bernie, because they're so convinced there's no way he can win, are just asking for a similar giant serving of karma like this. So, and if Bernie ends up winning, then things like this are going to look astonishingly foolish on the part of Republicans in places like South Carolina.
Yeah, just to clarify a couple of points. You mentioned that a lot of Senate Republicans have said that Amy Klobuchar is easy to work with. That is not the same as easy to work for, as we've pointed out in a number of cases. Go clean the comb, for example. And secondly, Virginia, they do make you, when you go vote in the primary, and as you said, there's no party affiliation in Virginia, and you walk up to the table and they ask you which primary ballot you want, and they give it to you, you do have to promise, Jim, to vote for that party's choice then in the general election, which I know everyone in Virginia does.
Yeah, I remember they wanted to make some sort of notary signed loyalty oath or something like that. And the first thing is let's imagine, yes, I promise I will vote for the Republican candidate. And then sometime between the moment they win the primary and general election day, turns out they have mob ties, found in bed with, an orgy involving a live pig, every scandal possible. Well, I promised the party I was going to vote for this SOB, so I guess I had no. It doesn't work that way. You know what would solve that? Closed primaries and registering by party. Why is that so hard in this state?
It's also completely unenforceable. It's not like you show up in November and they say, here's your sworn affidavit. We've already filled in your ballot for this guy because you promised us back in June that you would.
Right?
Not going to happen.
It's silly. It's like everybody's trying to come up with the most elaborate scenarios possible instead of just moving to closed primaries.
Oh, Jim, the craziness just abounds. All three today. I imagine we'll have at least one, if not more, tomorrow. So talk to you then. Our last day before the vaunted primary itself.
Can't wait, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos, Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Please subscribe to the podcast. Leave us a kind review with 5 stars, please. And also don't forget, you can find us on those home devices, Alexa, Google Home. All you have to say is play Three Martini Lunch podcast. We will see you tomorrow for the Friday edition of the Three Martini Lunch.